Could people take their seats, please, because we're going to start the sessions on topic 2. We have 4 presenters here, but the topic is divided between topic A, which is academic travelers, scholars, and students' impressions and how they influence it, and then media coverage, including the internet. So I will ask our 2 presenters on the first topic, academic travelers, scholars, and students, to speak first, and then we can have some questions and answers and discussion, and then we will move to the second part of the session. I'll try to allocate time about equally between the sessions. If the speakers could try to keep their remarks to about 15 minutes so that there will be time for discussion. We'll lead off with Dr. Chung Lee, who is the senior researcher, are you?
Hello.
A senior fellow at the John Thornton School on China at the Brookings Institution, and Associate Professor Zhang from Fudan University in Shanghai. Dr. Lee, could you begin?
Well, I'm delighted to be back at the Wilson Center, which actually hosted me as a residential fellow 8 years ago, and which in fact first opened Washington to me. And I want to particularly applaud the Kissinger Institute for organizing this very timely and important conference on mutual perceptions of the United States and China. I believe that your program represents a profound sense of forward-looking in American study of China, represents the Wilson Center's great tradition of critical thinking, and represents the enlightened pursuit of international dialogue. This is what I call 3 represents. Following Jiang Zemin's famous line, the theory of 3 represents. Now, my assignment this morning is to provide an assessment of U.S. scholars' views of China, especially U.S. perceptions or misperceptions of Chinese political and socio-economic issues. My discussion in the next 15 minutes or so, of course, does not aspire to present the state of the art, nor is it based on a comprehensive or quantitative research. Rather, I would like to address what I believe 3 main problems or 3 daunting challenges in the U.S.-China watching communities at present. The first relates to the growing tensions and difficulties of conceptualizing China. The second is about the methodological inadequacies in the wake of information revolution. And the third concerns about what I believe the ill-grounded predictions about China's political trajectory, especially the upcoming leadership succession. Now, I want to start with what I think I just want to echo what the ambassador said earlier. To get our perspective of China right is crucial for Washington, especially when China has more influence on the world economy and regional security than perhaps at any other time in modern history. As Jem Fellows, also will speak later, once said, I quote, "If our sights are distorted, our policy will be too." Now, the first major challenge reflects precisely some paradoxical developments in the American views of rising China. In virtually every important area of world affairs today, the United States needs China to play a proactive and constructive role, ranging from rebalancing the global economy to fighting climate change, from North Korea to Iran, from Pakistan to Afghanistan, from energy security to environmental protection, and from counterterrorism to cybersecurity. It is perhaps no longer an exaggeration to say that China has become the second most important country on the planet. As China becomes a major global economic power, her growing techno-nationalism, and especially her handling of domestic political issues, from human rights and religious freedom to ethnic tensions and media censorship, has increasingly caught the eyes of the international community. Not surprisingly, the U.S. public perception of China have remained or even become more negative. Now, these concerns, old and new, raise many important questions for our China-watching communities. For example, how can the United States promote candid and honest dialogue on these issues without appearing arrogant to the PRC government and the Chinese public? How can we respect China's achievements and encouraging cooperation with China without compromising our principles? And how do we envision China's political trajectory and of the U.S.-China relations in the next decade? What factors tend to shape our perceptions of the rapidly changing country? What are the sources and the possible remedies of the U.S. misperceptions of China? Now, unfortunately, these questions are not adequately addressed in the China-watching communities in the United States, let alone serious public or intellectual debate in the country. Now, let me move to the second problem, which is also a paradox or an irony, is the exposure of information on the one hand, but the lack of deep knowledge of China on the other hand. This is what John Nesbitt described as we are, I quoting, joining in information but starved for knowledge. This is a paradox we currently experience, particularly regarding China studies. Now, three important developments, namely, first, rapid changes in telecommunication and internet. Number two, the availability of a new open source in the PRC. So many new informations like bios of the leaders, autobiography of leaders, and etc. And number three, unprecedented dynamic Sino-US scholar exchange in many different ways, including the famous Yale Law Center really studied China, and also Michigan's quantitative survey research with Beijing University, and etc. I can give a long list. Mm-hmm. These developments have greatly altered the American scholarly approach to Chinese politics. Unfortunately, these developments do not always lead to a more insightful and a more accurate understanding of Chinese politics. Generally speaking, the field of Chinese political studies in the U.S. is still inadequate, both in the depth and the breadth of its coverage. Now, instead, many Western analysts have gravitated to one of the two extremes. This is what Terry said, the U.S. consistency of inconsistency, just two extremes. Never get things precisely right. So some remain burdened by stale perceptions, vulnerable to rumors, and are obsessed with investigating information obtained from unverified secret documents. And the other extreme is that other American scholars and prominent observers have become so impressed by the achievements of China and that they have lost their critical lens. Now let me move to the third problem. I will elaborate all these problems with some examples. But let me move to the third problem. I think is the most important one, is the ill-grounded prediction about the Chinese political trajectory, particularly leadership succession. American study of contemporary China have not been without rather glaring false predictions and blind spots. For example, with only a couple of exceptions, almost no scholarly attention was dedicated to China's oil supply and energy issues prior to 2001. And despite the fact that China began importing oil in 1994, 6 years before that, and its increasing need for energy security was already a foregone conclusion. But very few, almost none, except a couple of them in Hawaii, study energy security for in the 1990s, throughout the 1990s. But now it's become the hottest topic in Washington and everywhere about the China's energy. You can see, the drastic change, but in a way, it's also quite ironic. In the first half of the past decade, a large number of Chinese analysts and experts held a very pessimistic view of the fate of the Chinese regime. For example, three major events in the early part of the decade, namely China's accession to the WTO in 2001, the leadership succession in the 16th Party Congress in 2002, and the SARS epidemic in 2003, were all seen as formidable triggering factors. Many China analysts predicted that at that time that any of them or combination of them will lead to chaos or even the collapse of the regime. Gordon Zhang's 2001 book, famous book, The Coming Collapse of China was one of the most frequently cited monographs on China in the first half of the decade. But toward the end of the decade, a large number of China analysts seem to have gone to the other extreme. They began to perceive the Chinese political system as being resilient. The so-called resilient authoritarianism dominated the field. The logic holds that the CCP leaders seem to have found a sustainable way to maintain their rule over this emerging economic powerhouse. Meanwhile, a large number of China watchers in the United States seem to pay too much attention, in my view, the so-called Chinese confidence and Chinese arrogance, and they tend to overlook the vulnerability of the authoritarian one-party system, to seriously, and also the serious difficulties China faces, and also even possibility of a failure to broker deals between competing factions in the next leadership succession. I think these are serious challenges. We tend to overlook any of them. Now, one of the on the upcoming leadership succession, this is the area of my focus, will take place at the 18th Party Congress scheduled for the fall of 2012. Some prominent China watchers seem to be overly optimistic about the likelihood of a peaceful, orderly, and institutionalized transition. Actually, this is a term I used about 8 or 9 years ago, peaceful, orderly, and institutionalized transition. But that was, I refer to then, not necessarily for the next one. Now, recently in Singapore, there's a major meeting, and former leader Lee Kuan-yew said very positively about this upcoming succession. He said that things will be very smooth, will be much better than last time. I personally do not see that. Now, the most notable recent example is a book published by Robert Lawrence Kuhn, Kuhn, is that the right pronunciation? Kuhn. Right. Now, he's a business turned biography of the CCP leaders, particularly Jiang Zemin, but recently he wrote a book about the so-called fifth generation leaders. Kuhn offered nothing but the praise for their talents, wisdom, and vision. Of course, the fifth generation have a lot of good things. I don't want to talk about the good things, but I want to look at their weaknesses. Now, but I believe that the optimistic view exposed by Kuhn completely missed the weaknesses of the fifth generation leaders, especially some of its top contenders. In my assessment, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang will need to overcome many daunting obstacles in order to consolidate their power in the years to come. They are much weaker and far less impressive in a variety of ways than Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao when these two leaders are in line to succeed Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji in 2002. Now, at that time, among the fourth generation leaders, Hu Jintao was the only one who had experience as a provincial chief for 2 provinces. No other leader had that experience. So that really put him in very advantageous positions. He had also been on the Politburo Standing Committee for 10 years. Hu Jintao was very well known for his political savvy, strong networking with the Chinese Communist Youth League, and uncontroversial rhetoric ability. He seldom made a mistake in his oral remarks. Now also let's look at Wen Jiabao. Was already known for his leadership talents and administrative achievements when he was vice premier, or even early in his career. Wen Jiabao worked as a chief of staff for 3 secretary generals of the party, and 2 of them were purged, and yet Wen Jiabao managed not only to survive, but also to rise rapidly. Wen Jiabao had again broad administrative experience before becoming premier. Just give some examples. Coordinating political transitions, commanding the anti-flood campaign in 1998, supervising the nation's agricultural reforms, and overseeing financial and banking reform. Now, in particular, Wen Jiabao has been known, both at home and abroad, for his remarkably quick response during natural disasters and other crises. Now, in contrast, there are fears in China that Li Keqiang, who is expected to become next premier, has neither Premier Zhu Rongji's political guts nor Wen Jiabao's charisma and human touch. Now, a factor that makes the upcoming Chinese leadership succession even more uncertain is that other rising stars in the fifth generation, most noticeably Chongqing Party Secretary Bo Xilai and Guangdong Party Secretary Wang Yang, have launched self-promotion campaigns that have garnered great publicity in the country. They are unconventional and bold efforts to tape political opinion to seek political advancement may change the dynamics in which future leaders are competing for power. Now, the country may soon witness an even more dynamic and perhaps even more factionalized phase in its plan for political transformation. Now, let me conclude by saying that the field of American study of China, or Chinese politics, must avoid two extremes. One is dogmatic cynicism on the one hand, and also ill-grounded optimism or wishful thinking on the other. We need to be fully aware of the new institutional norms and rapid changing rules of the Chinese elite politics, the game of Chinese elite politics. But at the same time, we cannot allow ourselves to be guided by superficial phenomenon or official propaganda in China, unless and until we honestly recognize and work to challenge the enduring misperceptions in our analysis. We will not be able to propose wise and effective U.S. policy toward China. Thank you very much. I think it's 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Li. Your reference to Bo Xilai and Wang Yang, both of whom have the Chongqing connection, suggests that maybe we shouldn't just look at Beijing and Shanghai, we should also look at Chongqing in terms of affected.
Well, by the way, that's one professor at Oxford recently said that the future leaders of China will come from Chongqing. I do not see that. And he made a comparison between the Shanghai mafia and the Chongqing. But the Chongqing is very isolated. At maximum, probably 2 people can make to the Politburo and 1 probably Politburo Standing Committee. But that's maximum. But Jiang Zemin will bring a team from Shanghai. This politics has profoundly changed. And also Bo Xilai is no Jiang Zemin.
Okay.
Chongqing mafia has gone to jail, supposedly.
Sure, yeah.
Well,
That's our basic liability.
Yes, my presentation will cover now to the senior citizen like Bo Xilai. I would like to cover the young generation in China. Okay, yes, the sample, all of these samples just come from the urban in China, because you know the people who ages is over the 18 years old, most of them are staying in the university or move to the big cities or middle cities to have a job there. So it's pretty hard to do the survey in the rural area. Okay, so yeah, this chat just give my response to Professor Zhang. He just did presentation last panel. So yeah, if look this chart, you will find that since the 2005, the U.S. the favorability rating in the Chinese young generation mind is getting higher and higher. But normally, at the earlier stage of the new president administration, the U.S. The favorability ratings is lower. But the interesting thing is here. If you look at the 2008 and the 2009, but the Chinese young students, they are in favor of the United States. Maybe most of them are the Obama's fans. Maybe. Okay. But if you look, the low favorability rating here in the 2003, yes, there were some events happened in recent years. The United States invaded Iraq, and Chen Shui-bian took a lot of the independent policy, but the United States government at that time, they have some so-called strategic ambiguity policy to Chen Shui-bian's actions. That raised very angry among the Chinese young students. Yeah. So if you compare the gray line to the red line. For the ordinary Chinese people, they have 63% the people, or 65% of the people are in favor of the United States. But for the young generation, especially for the young student, they have 10% higher than ordinary Chinese peoples. They hold much more positive image about the United States. Okay, so if you ask which country is the most friendly country to the Chinese people, you can see these figures. You can find Russia. Yes, it's deeply impressed for the Chinese young student and Chinese ordinary peoples. Russia is the most friendly countries, but the United States is present better during these 3 years, from the 2007 to 2009. From the rank 10 to go to the rank 3 and 2. Okay. Of course, in the Chinese student's mind, the U.S. is most important to the China economically. Even the U.S. image present not so good during the last decade, the 2000 to the 2005. But the Chinese young students, they still think that U.S. is a very important country to the China, especially from the economic views. Yes. The figure here present the students groups. They think the United States is most important countries to the China. And if you compare these two fields, especially in the after the financial crisis, but the most of the Chinese students, they still think the United States is a very important economic partner to the China. If we refer to which country is the most important security partner to the China, of course, Russia. But the United States also very important. From the 2007 to 2009, the rank number 2. Yes, for the students groups, the most of them, they think that the China we have a very close security partners with the Russians, but we still have a big number of the Chinese students. They think, especially in the 2009, they think the United States played a very important role in a cooperation to the international securities with the China. Okay, so I have some data is about the Chinese non-scholar, include scholar and entrepreneurs and some professionals. They have a different view with the Chinese ordinary people and the Chinese students. But if you think this chart, this survey conducted in 2007, but most of the Chinese people, include the opinion leaders and the general residents and the students, they think the relationship between our two countries is stable. But if you ask the two governments their performance on the relationship between the China and the United States, even the opinion leaders groups and the general resident groups and the students groups, they have very positive comments on the Chinese government performance. But they think the United States performance on the relationship between our two countries not so good. Yeah. If you ask the student, so to make the comments about the status quo of our two countries' relationships, more than almost 90%, the young generation, they think the relationship between our country is a very good and very good. And most of them, they think we should keep this kind of the relationships. Yeah, if you ask the students, ask them to predict the relationship between our two countries in the 10 years, or 5 to 10 years, they think the relationship between our two countries would not going to worse, but they still think we should keep the cooperation. But over the half of our interviewee, especially among the student groups, not only cooperation, the cooperation and the tension will be coexist in the 2 or 10 years after. Okay, so yeah. The young generation, they think we should keep cooperation in 2 or in 5 or 10 years. So we have some cooperate areas like trade, energy, and the environment. So most young generation and general resident and opinion leaders, they think the most important area we can cooperate is trade. But here, most of the students, if you compare other groups, they think energy areas should be more pay attention by the Chinese cooperation with the United States. So why the Chinese students have confidence about those two countries' they can cooperations? Because we share some common interest and a common point of view on these issues, like crack down the international crimes and environment protecting and anti-international terrorism, and some promote the economic growth. Yeah. Okay, if you ask students, the American people, the Chinese students, their impression about American people, about American culture, even about the American democracies, they give very positive on these 3 issues. For example, they think the American people is a nice people. You can, even among the students groups, they have over 80% in favor of the American people. I didn't do the survey, especially about the Bush. Yeah, but general people is very good impression in the Chinese young generation mind. Okay, if you ask, do you favor American democracy? Of course, yes. Over the 70% the Chinese young generation, they will give very positive comments on the American democracies. Of course, I'm sorry. Of course, we have a lot of the young generation. They are American culture fans. They like American culture, the music, TV programs, and the movies. Yeah, if you ask, do you get the influence from the American cultures? 3 groups give their very, very positive answers here, over the 40%. Okay, so if you ask the young generation, do you have an experience to American festival? Over the 60%, the young Chinese students, they have such kind of the experience, like a Christmas, like somewhat, but the festival ceremony is different. Christmas in China for young students, we not reunite with our family. We just participate in the dance. Okay. Do you like American fast food? Oh my God. Over 70% of the Chinese students, they say in favor of the Chinese fast food. Even what? Yeah, of course, American fast food. But, okay, the Chinese entrepreneur, they learn a lot from the American fast food. The Chinese fast food get much more popular right now. Okay, so if you ask, do you watch or see the American film in last month? Over 50% the Chinese students do. Okay, that means that American cultures have a great influence on the Chinese young generation. Okay, if you ask what kind of issue will play very important role on relationship between our two countries, of course, as you may know, Taiwan issues. Yes, there have some difference between the opinion leaders group and the students groups. Almost 60% opinion leaders, they think Taiwan issues is very important to our relationships. But we still have 40% the young generation, they think is very important to our relationships. Okay, if you ask the Chinese students that the United States is still a superpower in these wars, yes, about the 33% of the Chinese the students say yes. A little bit more, the Chinese opinion leaders say yes. Here you can see the Chinese young generation, they have confidence about the China will become the leading superpower. Here, 44% of the Chinese students, they have a very positive view about the Chinese becoming the superpowers. But it will be true, I don't know. But in their mind, they think it will be true. Okay. If you ask the Chinese students, how about the United States, their attitude toward the Chinese rights? That surprised me. Is a lot of the students, they think, okay, United States welcome Chinese rights. Okay. So if you ask the Chinese students, does the United States treat China with the respect? This data also surprised me. They think fair account or great deal is if you plus these two data is over the 70%. The people, they think the United States can treat China with respect. Yeah, to see these figures, especially this chart, you can find the over the 48% of the Chinese people that think the United States international influence will weak. But over the 90% of the Chinese students that think the China international influence will be stronger. Yeah, the same thing. If you ask the percent, over the 40%, the Chinese, the students, they think, okay, Americans still top one in this world. But if you ask, after 10 years, what's going to happen? It's changed. Over the 42% of the Chinese young generation, they think Chinese will play a very important role in the world stage. But you shouldn't just take notice about the presentation, the PPT above. You should notice here. If you ask, the China would be a hegemony, almost 80% of students rebel against China to become the hegemony. But foreigner people in China, they have 44%. They think China would not be a hegemony. Okay. Even the China students, they have very positive comments about the United States image. But we still have around 90% of the Chinese students that think the United States will be main threat to China. The second one is Japan. Okay, what kind of issue that will be threat the world peace? The first one is a proliferation of the nuclear. The second one is, Americans' hegemonyism. Okay. So here you can see the Chinese students, they think most threatened countries and the regions to the China is the United States. Okay, so I don't have so much time. If you ask the United States performance on the world stages, anti-terrorism ranked top one. Promoting world peace and safety, U.S. ranked top one in the Chinese young generation. And spread democracy to other countries also ranked top one. Okay, countries respecting other nations' peoples. Okay, last two. Yeah. Very quickly, sorry. Yes. If you ask a Chinese nation, do you have experience of the the foreign countries' product? That's very interesting. Cosmetics, fashions, luxury, retails, cruising, grape wine, agriculture, financial, high-speed railway, and aircraft. The France present a very beautiful curve here. So United States here. If you take the person's figure to understand this picture, the France present just like women's figures. Okay, the United States much more men. But don't worry about. If you see the next figures, the U.S. is still one of the most favorable vacation land for the urban youth. Okay, so not only just the high income, even the middle income and the low income. Yeah. Yeah, in this figure is strongly present that the United States high-tech product deeply impressed the Chinese young generation. It's ranked top one. Okay, so manufacture ranked top two, out-ranked top two, and the household applicants ranked top two. So the United States product is present very well in the Chinese young generations. Okay, if you ask which countries has more innovative spirit, of course, around 65% Chinese students think United States has more innovative spirit. And almost 75% Chinese students think United States, you have advanced technologies. So I want to say, even the Chinese students, they have a very positive comments about the United States images. But in the Chinese mind, students' mind, they still think or they still worry about the United States to China. But if you look at this chart, we have a lot of the cultural exchanges. We have a lot of economic interdependence. So that means I try to give a very clear explanation what kind of the public opinion, especially from the Chinese young student, will impact on the Chinese foreign policies. If you go with the realistic way, you cannot get very good conclusions. But if you go back to the English school of the international relationship, maybe we can find some resolution, because we have a different value. But we also have a common value, especially anti-global warming, anti-terrorism, environment protecting. We have a common value from these grounds. So I would like to say, I would like to use the Chairman Mao's saying. Chairman Mao saying, the young generation like sun. But unfortunately, the Chairman Mao, they didn't tell me the sun in the winter or sun in the summer. But fortunately, he just mentioned the young generation like sun at around 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning. That means even in the summer, the sun is not so hot. It's warm. The last words I will present here. If you don't want to lose China, you should not lose the China young generation. Thank you.
Thank you for those two very interesting presentations. Since scholars and students are one of the areas that we're looking at in this session, and since the Obama administration has announced a program of trying to get 100,000 American students studying in China over the next 4 years, which is a very substantial increase in the number of students, I wonder, Dr. Li and Professor Jiang, whether you could comment on whether you think significantly increasing the number of students studying in China will have a positive or negative impact on American impressions of China.
Well, I think it's a good thing. I think that someone said that the future of humankind is really the race between education and catastrophe. We should look at pay more attention to China. As I said, it's the second most important country in the world. Our knowledge of China is still limited, so limited, compared with 200 million Chinese study English. And what's the population of this country study Chinese? And again, that's a serious problem until we pay attention. We send more people. In my view, 100,000 is not enough. But on the other hand, that we still have the financial problem. And actually China takes the check. I mean, China will pay 10,000 students for that. But still, like in the California system, we want to cut the Chinese language system, teaching, and many other schools where the funding comes from. So there's a serious structure problem, economic structural problem in the United States. But again, that I only hope that what happened during the past 10 years certainly should be a wake-up call for the United States, that we should come to terms with China's rise. We should not only just look at China's economic dynamics, social development, but also the fundamental transformation of China's political system. It's just a start to emerge.
Professor Zhang, do you have a comment?
Yeah. I totally agree with the Professor Li Chen's comments. Yes, in my class, we have a lot of the foreign students. We're discussing a lot of the sensitive topics. It's no matter about whether or not we accept my view on some special topic. The very important things that in that class I can present the whole picture to our students. Let them have a very good understanding about the Chinese government policies and the general Chinese people's attitude to this world. That's very significant. So I totally agree with you. 1,000, maybe 10,000 students come to China is not enough. Of course, we also encourage our students to go to the United States to have experience, educational experience, even the working experience here, to contact the local people, try to get more understanding about the American society. That's very important. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for discussion on this topic, which is, again, academic travelers, scholars, and students, how they are impacting on our perceptions. So are there questions from the audience here related to this? Yes.
Hi, my name is Peng Wang. I'm a junior economist at World Bank. Actually, in one of the presentation slides, Dr. Jiang, you showed, I was interested in finding that among the junior students, they found the energy and the environmental issue has been two of the top three priorities. So I want to get a general sense, based on your survey, do you have any clue, the Chinese young student, what's their perception about this climate change, especially, after the Copenhagen. I know this vice chairman of the NDRC, he made a presentation at Beijing University and also Tsinghua University. And in one of his speech, he mentioned that actually the climate change is to reduce China's development scope. So I don't know if, based on your experience with Chinese students, what their perceptions towards this climate change, and do you think the China's role and the U.S. the role and the relationship between these two countries on this climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, that's very good questions. Yeah. I didn't do any survey about this kind of issues, but we have some talks with my students about the climate changes. The three things I should mention here. My students have a very great passion, try to explore what's truly happened in the Copenhagen. Especially, they try to understand the position taken from our government. The first one. The second one is climate change. Yes, is a very hot topic, especially for the students' papers and dissertations. Most of them, they have a very great interest in about the Tokyo protocols, how build up the international cooperative regime, and what kind of role the Chinese should play in these issues. The third one is for the Chinese young student, maybe because they are young, they don't have a sophisticated point of view on these issues. But a lot of the Chinese students, they participate or take part in the associations, some NGO, some groups, to deal with the environment, to participate in the action like environment protectings and the climate change discussions.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Wang Huiyao. I'm from Western Returned Scholar Association from China, but also currently as a visiting scholar at the Brookings. I agree with Ambassador Rowe's comments on the student exchanges because the Western Returned Scholar Association in China look after many Western returned scholars, about 50,000 of them. But I think there is a big gap for the students who are already in China and also in the U.S. For example, China sends about over 200,000 students overseas in 1 year, and also most of them come to the U.S. So I think there's a big gap and big opportunity for the U.S. student to go to China, and that will enormously impact the future Sino-U.S. relations. So that's a very good expert's opinion. I think just now 3 of you mentioned. Also, a previous panel mentioned about the Yale student delegation to China. We had a positive impact. So my question to the panel would be that do you see more on the government exchanges in addition to the student? For example, official exchanges and people in the administration and academic and more than student. Thank you.
Well, there are some plus and minus. The plus is those leaders, they came to the United States sometime, a few months, 3 months or half a year, and then certainly it's an open eye, eye opener for them, and they also have the kind of perception they are part of this, exchange program, beneficiary of this program. But one problem is a little learning is a dangerous thing, not only for those Chinese leaders, or future leaders, but also for us and those Americans who study in China for a short period of time. I think we do need to, absorb in society to understand the inner working of the society. And this is precisely that the Luce Foundation and the Ford Foundation will emphasize in the future. Now, you look at those returnees now working in China, particularly top levels, in the central committee or vice minister levels or above, only 1 or 2 of them really live in the United States for a longer period of time. And one person is Yi Gang, is the vice governor of People's Bank. He probably has longest tenure in the United States, taught at the University of Indiana or Indiana University for 6 or 7 years, but still from school to school. So there's no experience in terms of, local government, U.S. local government, think tanks, religious group, and Professor Wang Jisi at Beida said, if you want to understand the United States, you should understand religion in the United States. And also, if you want to understand the policy-making process, you should know better about Washington. Of course, now there's something changed. There's some distinguished scholar like Professor Yuan now live in the United States and many others. That's a good thing, but still not enough. And this is also Tom Finger, our former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, always asks that we should also develop capacity to live in a village in China or work in a factory in China, work in the University of China, but make a broad sense of what the country is all about. So make sense of the country's direction, but by looking at one particular case. But in the United States, our problem is particularly in academic field, in economics, political science, sociology, becomes so technical. So it make a perfect sense into our study, but cannot link to the broad trend of the U.S.-China relation and China's political trajectory. So this, again, is a new kind of challenge, new kind of deficiencies we face. So we need to, on the one hand, we deal with the old problem, but also we need to deal with some new problems. And also one thing I want to add, earlier I mentioned about information revolution. There's tremendous information about China available, including military development. There's so many websites run by Chinese, or maybe by children of Chinese military officers. Really tremendous information, but very few of our analysts, really study them. Certainly there's no major work produced by this kind of development.
Yeah,
Professor Zhang, I'll give you a chance to comment on this question, but we have a question from our overflow room that is directed at you, from Sonia Regler, who's with the U.S. Congress, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And she wants to know, did the campaigns run in the United States by our civil society on Tibet and Darfur in Sudan before the Olympics negatively affect the perceptions of the United States by Chinese youth? In other words, the active role here to draw attention to these issues such as Tibet and Darfur, in which China was portrayed in a negative light generally. did this have an impact on Chinese views of the United States among youth?
Yes, I can't say the whole Chinese student, they have a strong interest in these issues. For the students from the international relations and the international politics, they might have interest in these topics. Yes, a lot of the Chinese students, they have their own point of view about the issues debate in the U.S. Congress, but generally they have one image about maybe United States congressmen, you don't have rich knowledge about the China or Chinese government. So they just curious about why you are reacting on these sensitive topics. I cannot say the Chinese young students, they also have a rich knowledge about the Darfur, even the Tibet issues. They just learn some stories from the newspapers and the textbooks. Yes. I don't think generally most of the Chinese students, they have a strong interest in these topics. Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to add something on the previous question?
Yes, that gentleman just raised the questions. I just want to mention one point you should pay attention to. More and more Chinese young students, they pursue their advanced education in the European countries, more and more. Especially, most of them are the next generation of the Chinese entrepreneur. So you must pay attention to this phenomenon. The second is, you just mentioned that the United States government, you should send more the government official to China. But on the China side, because in our school we have so-called MPA programs, we give very advanced training for the Chinese official at high levels. We also have a very good cooperation with the United States college and universities. Every year we send our part of our students to the United States, learning in the universities, and also we send them to the United States government at different levels. So we hope that United States government, you can send your officials to the China more and more. We can have a more understanding with each other.
Yeah. Dr. Lee, you had a brief question, because I'm about to turn to the second.
Yeah, I have a question for my colleague. You know, your presentation makes perfect sense to me that the Chinese young people or Chinese public has a love-hate attitude towards the United States. Love because of American, personality, values, and
movie,
the other things.
Entertainment. Yeah.
But at the same time, that fear that U.S. is the only country may put China down. Now, this is not my question. My question is how Chinese leaders look at the survey, or similar surveys. What kind of conclusion they can get from this survey in terms of deal with the United States? Now, here's my interpretation. I just want to hear from you whether this perception is correct or incorrect. If I were Chinese leaders, when I look at these surveys, I will conclude to be too accommodating to the United States will not resonate well back at home. But to be anti-U.S. will be even more dangerous. Do you agree with that perception from Chinese perspective, leaders' perspective?
Okay, so I cannot give you abstract response to your questions, but if we focus on the special policy area, I can give you response. For example, if you issue related to the Chinese sovereignties, like Taiwan issues, I think the Chinese government, they have pay more attention to the survey like this. I don't agree you are adopt that the public opinion will impact on the Chinese foreign policy.
I didn't say that.
Okay, so the public opinion on some specific issues, they play a very important role. For example, Japan, the relationship between Japan and China. Okay, so if the Chinese government, I don't know whether or not you want to, they have an interest in my presentation, but if they watch or look with PPT, yeah, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to make a final decision, anti or pro. Okay, but let's depend. If the U.S. government, they take position to support the Taiwan independent policies, no problems. If you do the survey at one times, over 80% young China student will support the Chinese position, no problems. Okay, if you want to abandon some famous film in China, maybe the young students against, maybe they don't agree such kind of the policy. That's depend the policy area or policy issues.
We're now going to turn. There'll be a chance later. I hope at the end of the second session. I think we'll have 15 minutes when maybe we can combine the panels and then have a more opportunity to broaden out the questions. But now we're going to turn to the role of media and internet in informing perceptions. We have an exceptionally strong team, as we've already had on the other topics. Ms. Tian Wei is a moderator for China Central Television talk show Dialogue and a regular anchor of CCTV's special coverage of domestic and international affairs. She's also been a journalist here in Washington, and she's also worked on radio, so those of you who think that radio and television are biased one way or the other, she can balance the two out. And she will be followed by Jim Fallows, who is the chair in U.S. media at the University of Sydney, a national correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly, has been an editor of U.S. News and World Report, and recently spent 3 years, was it, Jim, in Beijing. So he has recent experience living there. We'll begin with Ms. Tian.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Roy. I see you have got all our information on hand. It's a very heartwarming feeling coming back to Washington. I remember last time I waved goodbye to this city, there was a sense of vulnerability in the air. It was 7 years ago, right after the war in Iraq. And now coming back, even though there is still the impact of the financial crisis being felt here, but I see, at least I sense over the past few days staying here, growing sense of confidence in the air. So on that, I feel so happy for my friends here in the United States. 7 years have passed, many years have passed over the past few years, but, many things happened. China has grown. The U.S. has changed. Yet the two countries have realized the increasing importance and urgency to draw upon some strategic policies towards each other in the for the long time to grow. So on that point, I really want to express my appreciation both for the Kissinger Institute and also for U.S.-China Center with the Tsinghua University for your academically open-mindedness and your continuous encouragement for all of us to investigate and brainstorm some of the biggest trends when it comes to this most fascinating and therefore challenging bilateral relations in the world. Having said that, though, our topic today is perception. Wow. Last time I checked in the dictionary, it's supposed to be a psychological term, not a foreign policy term. Just to follow your words, Ambassador Roy. And what does it mean, really, perception? You probably could help me to understand this very complicated English explanation. What one perceives is a result of interplays between past experiences, including one's culture, and the interpretation of the perceived. Sounds complicated. At least it sounds very tricky. So on that tricky question, I'm sure both sides would find them controversial, if not notoriously emotional. When we talk about notoriously emotional, of course, people will come up with the word press. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, now let's talk about the press. As a media practitioner, I can constantly feel the existence and the evolution of perceptions the two countries, the two peoples, the two media have about each other over the past few years. As a former Washington correspondent, as a Chinese TV host, hosting two flagship shows on CCTV, China's biggest television broadcaster, and also as a columnist for Global Times, which many consider as the most nationalistic newspaper in China, and as a blogger, as many of you maybe also are sitting here in the audience, and micro blogger I am now also, and also, shall I say, maybe a fanatic already on the microblogging, because it's really developing really fast here in China. So many kinds of medias are active here in China. Before we really tackle what exactly is the perception of the Chinese media, can I just update you? I know many of you have been traveling to China frequently. Maybe for the sake of our audience of C-SPAN, update you a little bit about exactly what is the Chinese press, what made of the Chinese press. In China, brief introduction, 7,000 kinds of periodicals and magazines, 2,000 different kinds of newspapers, and the number certainly is growing all the time. My home organization, CCTV, has 18 open public channels. And you can imagine there are also many, many other TV stations at very different kinds of local levels across China. Meanwhile, the new media is developing dramatically here in China. We have, of course, the news websites, the social networking websites, and the blogs, microblogging, and the text messaging, you name it. There are so many kinds, and the ownership is also complicated. It's not like the old times, everybody is supposed to be the propaganda machine of the government, but rather it's very diversified. You could find public-owned, government-owned, private-owned, commercial media, joint venture, even total foreign invested media. So the media is not like black and white in China anymore. Having said that, though, there's another thing I need to brief you about. How media is being influenced, what type of perceptions media is forming right now in China, and how they form those perceptions. There are several factors, if I could just go through them very quickly. For example, the general decline in the influence of political ideologies in China, the growing public sophistication and sometimes skepticism toward policies in China, and also the diversified intellectual debates and increasing contact with the West and the rest of the world, and of course, the intense competition in the media market. The competition in the media market is dramatic, I have to say. Even my home organization, once again, CCTV, it is not like the government will bring you all the cash and therefore you do whatever program you want to do or what the government wants you to do, but rather it needs to be commercially independent. In other words, the media are shouldering various kinds of roles. They are a state-owned public broadcaster. They're also public TV. They're supposed to inform people. And they're also commercial entity. They're supposed to make their own livings. So these are the very sophisticated, very complicated issues revolving the growth of Chinese media. And that's already a very long introduction. So now let's go to the exact perception that the media is having about the United States and how that is really impacting on the common people in China or on the government policy in China towards the U.S. As we said earlier, since it's a very complicated picture in China already about the media, it's very hard for me to use the next maybe 7 minutes to sum it up as to what are the perceptions, how it's influencing. So I took the liberty secretively to narrow it down to several questions, and I wonder if you would agree with me on these questions. The very first question, Mr. Ambassador also mentioned that at the very beginning of this talk, is the perception of the Chinese media that the United States is weakening while China is getting stronger, and therefore it is time for China to challenge the United States. Is that true? Well, I think it's a very timely question and also strategically important question, because there's ongoing debate in the world today as whether there is a power shift from the United States to China in the world. So how can we understand that? Let's take a look at some of the so-called apparent challenge that China is posing toward the United States. One of those issues, most recent one, would be about the ELOC, the possible joint military drill between the United States and South Korea, with the U.S. suggesting that it's likely to send George Washington aircraft carrier to the LOC, with the Chinese responding saying that it's going to touch on our fundamental interest and therefore we are against it. And that is still in the air. Whether things can be decided or not will depend on the trip of Secretary Clinton, I guess, after the 21st of this month. But let's take a look at what China media has been saying about this. I took the sample of two newspapers in China. One is supposed to be nationalistic and rhetorical, the newspaper that I work as a columnist for, which is Global Times. The other is called Southern Weekend. It is rather believed to be a liberal newspaper based in southern part of China. So let's see how they cover the story. Global Times, as always, being a affiliated paper of the People's Daily, it used a editorial which is named "Don't Let the LOC Drill Become the Start of U.S. Strategic Blackmail Against China." In it, it argues, and here I quote, "The ELC should be a prohibited zone to the Pentagon. China is not a weak country," it argues. "The United States cannot treat China as if treating nobody. If the Pentagon is imagining it could turn back the clock 100 years and do whatever it wants to China, then it was making its biggest ignorant strategic mistake," end of quote. It's hard to read the rhetoric. The Southern Weekend, one would imagine probably they're going to take a very different approach, because they usually do. And these two newspapers compete with one another in the Chinese market. One is going to this extreme, the other is going to that extreme. But ladies and gentlemen, not necessarily in this case. And here is what I found in the latest edition of Southern Weekend. There's a story called, let's see what it's called. Okay, the U.S. is only one aircraft carrier away from China. Wow. It sounds threatening, isn't it? So the only difference between the two papers is that Southern Weekend, instead of using rhetoric, it is actually trying to line out what are some of the possible disadvantages China would have to face to if U.S. sent George Washington aircraft to the aircraft carrier to the Yellow Sea. So one would argue that probably this would show how much the strong perception Chinese media is having about the United States, and how much that is really impacting on the Chinese public, and how much that is contributing to the very strong attitude Chinese government have about against the United States. But it may not be the case. Let me just go through a little bit more on that research. The messages sent by the two newspapers, the Southern Weekend and the Global Times, certainly has been received by the Chinese public. I am blogging on one of the most popular, microblogging on one of the most popular social networking sites in China. And here's what I found during a very dull Sunday morning in Washington, D.C., closed myself in the hotel room. Here's what I found. There are from July the 11th to July the 18th, there are 1,433 microblog messages on this very specific subject about the LOC joint drill. And of course, compared to the comments about the World Cup or about Paul, as some of you may know, the most popular figure during the World Cup, which is 90,000 microblogs about them. This, of course, is a very low figure, but for a current affairs story, this is certainly at the top of the list. So after reading through the 1,423 of them, here is the number I found. As you said, we don't have many survey companies in China, so I have to do it myself. We have
who support you?
50% of those who are sending those microblogs, they clearly stated that the U.S. is threatening China and China should fight back. 45% did not give any personal comment on the story, but provided a web link to the news stories on the subject in the Chinese media. 2.5% said China should maintain or remain cool-minded and come up with a cool strategy afterward. And there were also 2.5% who said China would not dare to do anything toward the U.S. And of course, there are several microblogs that didn't really say anything, or at least I don't understand what they're saying. One might take this example as one explicitly showcase of the theory that China, with the hardline attitude adopted by the Chinese press, is challenging the United States and therefore confirming the notion that we mentioned in our first question. But I would argue, yes, China and the Chinese press in this case is challenging the U.S. However, it does not have much to do at all with the perception that China has or the Chinese media has about the so-called assumption that the U.S. is getting weaker and China is getting stronger, and therefore it's time for China to challenge the U.S. Rather, this China is challenging the U.S., or the Chinese media is challenging the U.S., Chinese public is challenging the U.S. in response to the U.S. challenge towards China, or at least what they perceive as the U.S. challenge towards China. So why would I say that? Am I being so ideological or propagandic here? I believe not, because I continue to read those two newspapers over the past few days and even weeks and found three more interesting phenomena. First, the two newspapers not only publish very rhetorical stories or stories that are supposed to show the U.S. is threatening China, but also the many varied attitudes other countries involved in the issue have to say about the issue. DPRK, ROK, and the United States, of course. And secondly, the two papers also published either editorials or columns about another option for the two countries to take, which is not let any country or any specific interest groups or any specific events taking advantage of the very strategic interest that the two countries have toward each other. And I guess that echoes very well with many of the experts that are coming to this conference in the Chinese delegation. And thirdly, the two newspapers, though they published some rhetorical articles, none of them ever mentioned at all that China should preempt U.S. interest in the region. Rather, they were only saying that China should react to what they perceive as the U.S. challenge towards China. So that is one question. It's already very long. And I have two very briefly, just to mention the next 2 points. Question number 2 is, what is the Chinese media's perception on the question whether the U.S. as a country is still worth respect, despite of the controversy it got itself in with the war in Iraq and with the financial crisis? I think our professor and Professor Sun, Professor Zhang, earlier in their speeches have all handled this question very specifically, so I wouldn't go into details. Just one very light note. I think you know that China is fascinated about soccer, though our national team never really only once entered into the World Cup final. But over the past World Cup, which just concluded, even though the U.S. team only got into the top 16, as you may know, Chinese are ranking the U.S. team as the top 8 most favorable team for the Chinese. So in a way, you can see the Chinese perceptions about the U.S. even reflected in the soccer. And of course, that also reflected in Chinese understanding about the oil spill in the Mexico Gulf, because people are very sympathetic rather than just emphasizing that it's going to be a challenge for the Obama administration and for the politics here in the U.S. People are saying this is also a good opportunity for China to take a look at its own environmental challenges and disasters. And last question, which I think probably would have a lot to do with, I believe, wonderful speech given by my colleague Jim Fallows, that is whether the Chinese media's perception about what the West believe about China would have any impact on the Chinese media's perception about the West. So on that note, I have compiled some of the examples, but I don't think we have the time to go through all of them. But there's one story I think it's worth mentioning. I was talking to our friend just now, the wonderful lady in red, Ellen, yes. And we were saying about the policy China has designed, so-called indigenous innovation. Many foreign businesses believe that is a policy biased towards towards foreign businesses because they give more opportunity to the Chinese businesses, and therefore investment environment in China has been decreasing or deteriorating. But here is an interesting survey done by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. It did a survey called Business Climate in China 2010 in the first quarter. Here is what they have found, and let me just quickly read through some of those. And maybe through that you would realize why some Chinese media think there are biased perceptions against China, and whether that is being reflected in Chinese media's reporting about the West too. Among them, 90% of companies feel their businesses either has improved or stayed the same in the last 6 months. 78% of companies feel the business environment either has improved or stayed the same over the past 6 months. And even within the 22% that perceive the situation to have worsened, 69% still feels that their business has improved or stayed the same. 63% of companies have not changed their company's plan in the last 6 months. Out of the 37% that have changed their plans, more than 80% actually were increasing their activity in China. So you bet the Chinese media would jump on this story. But I've already talked long enough, and I'm sure we are going to have some very good conversations and communication with one another afterwards, after this session. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Tian. Okay, Jim Fallows.
Thank you very much. We are indeed running late with fascinating material, and precisely because my topic is so vast, I will condense it radically and have a short presentation touching the high points. I'm supposed to talk about the U.S. media's, the Western media's perceptions of China, U.S. in particular. And I'd like to present this in the form of a paradox to be explained. The elements of the paradox are these. Number one, I think the personnel, the people now manning the U.S. media, in particular in China, are first rate. If you had to compare average journalistic skills, language preparation, sophistication, sympathy for the home country, and almost any other measure of what would make an excellent repertorial corps, probably the average talent level of the people now on duty in China is higher than the average anyplace else, including in New York, including in Washington, including in Paris, including any place else. And I would include even in this a sense of sympathy and fellow feeling with the country that these people are reporting in. So one element is we have perhaps the best qualified on average group of people who are reporting from China that we have any place. Second, I'm still setting up the paradox here. I think it is, I'm impressed, having spent 3 of the last 4 years living in China, at the difficulty of understanding some of the feel and the trends and the nuances of China from reading or listening to or watching the output of that excellent cadre of people. So we have a very talented group of people producing an output which I say is hard to get a sort of full picture of China from. And third element of the paradox, I think the explanation is not what would often be assumed by many people in China, which is some bias, some nationalistic desire to hold China down, some kind of predisposition against against rendering a fully nuanced picture of China. How, therefore, if you accept with me for purposes of argument for the next few minutes, that these three things are true. That's an excellent group of people, that it's a partial view of China that comes through, and it's not because of bias. How, therefore, do we unravel this paradox, and what solution is there? And I do actually have a solution at the end. So that is my goal to explain for the next few minutes. The next step is to say, what exactly is the problem that we have to define here or to explain here? And again, I would differ from many people inside China in saying the problem to be interpreted is not some sort of excessive anti-Chinese bias or tone in the U.S. media or in U.S. public life. Indeed, whenever I hear some cautionary talks from people in the Chinese media or Chinese public affairs about what they fear as an anti-Chinese tone in U.S. politics or China bashing or whatever, I try to remind them of the role that China actually plays in U.S. public discourse. For example, in the Obama-McCain presidential campaign of 2008, in the presidential debates, there really was only one mention of China in those debates when each of the candidates said they thought that the economic imbalance between the two countries was unsustainable in terms of debt. In President Obama's recent State of the Union speech, really the only mention of China was saying if the Chinese can have this drive for renewable energy, so too can the U.S. Perhaps the most important metric, as you all know, the congressional elections happening this fall are bitterly fought all around the country. And I bet you could not find more than one or two of the 435 congressional relations this fall in which China was even in the top 5 issues. You know, it's a very, very bitterly divided case in which China is not really a part of the national debate. I certainly think it should be a larger part of the U.S. national debate, but if there's fear in the Chinese media of an excessively anti-Chinese tone, I think there's very little evidence of it in the actual course of U.S. Politics. Rather, I would say, the problem to explain in U.S. China coverage is something you can define this way. A measure of the press's adequacy in rendering a certain topic is whether actually being in a country, living there, spending time there day by day, seems and feels different from having read about it before. And the more there is that gap, the more there is some failure of the press to convey everything that there is about a certain place. There always is some difference in reading about a place and living there. I think there's a particular one when it comes to China. The feeling of being there is much more complicated than one gets in the press. And I would just tick off quickly a few things that I think most foreigners resident in China recognize as part of the reality of today's China, which are very, very hard to infer from reading the daily press coverage or the monthly coverage. One, for example, is the simple diversity, scale, chaos, difference, variety of China. Many people within China recognize that it's often less a country than it is a continent or a loose assemblage of provinces and interest groups and all the rest. The huge variety of economic levels, of interests, of policies. You all know that. People who read the U.S. press may have a harder time understanding how varied the country can be. A second element, which is evident inside China but less so in the press, is the extent of China's own problems, the many obstacles that the leadership and the people still have to confront as they deal with environmental challenges, with the nature of the university system, with evolution of politics, all the other things that many of you have talked about for a large time. The version that tends to come across in the U.S. media is either everything is working great for China or China's about to fall apart. And the fact that both of those things are probably true, and are true moment by moment, is something which is evident day by day, living there, and harder to convey in the press. A related element, which is evident in Chinese life but harder to convey, is the fact that almost every trend is meeting a counter trend within China. Mm-hmm. For example, I did a big piece about a year and a half ago about the environmental predicament in China for The Atlantic, where I quoted a government white paper saying, the situation for China's environment is grave and with positive developments. And both those things are true. It is grave and there are positive developments. And conveying that tension is an important part of reality there and hard to do in life, in reportage. A few more in this litany.